In Japanese, there are three main levels of politeness. We can call these informal, polite, and super polite. We'll have a look in a moment at when we should actually use each of these different levels of politeness. But before we do that, I just want to show you how these actually differ. And really, they're mostly determined by the verb ending of the main verb. So generally, if the main verb is in a certain level of politeness, then the whole sentence will be. There are a few other things that can be changed or will be changed in certain circumstances, but the main thing is that the main verb is in the appropriate form. For example, with the verb tabemasu, meaning to eat, the polite present future tense is tabemasu, and the polite negative form, for example, is tabemasen. The informal equivalents of this are taberu and tabenai. So tabemasu and taberu mean the same thing, just tabemasu is polite, taberu is informal. Similarly, tabemasen is polite and tabenai is informal, and both of those mean to not eat. So with most sentences, whatever the verb is that's at the end of the sentence, which is usually the main verb of that sentence, whatever form that is in, that tells us whether the sentence is polite, informal, or even super polite. So let's now look at when we should use each of these different levels of politeness. And when we're trying to work this out, there are two main factors that apply. The first one is rank. Depending on the rank of somebody, you will use either more polite or less polite language. And rank is determined by age or seniority. And there are different ways that we can determine rank. For example, rank can be general. Generally, in society, people who are older than you need to be more polite to, and people who are younger than you can be less polite to. But it can also be within a group or organization. For example, in a company, if you have people who are your supervisors or your bosses, you need to be more polite to them, whereas the bosses themselves, they can speak less formally to people below them. It can also be determined by specific types of relationships. For example, customers are higher ranking than the people that service them. So for example, if you're in a restaurant, the people serving you at the restaurant are likely to speak to you in a more polite form of language. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should speak informally back to them, but in that situation, the customer is higher ranking than the service provider. So generally speaking, if somebody is of higher rank than you need to speak politely to them. If they're of lower rank, then you can get away with speaking with them more informally. If somebody is the same rank, then you can also use informal language. So if you're talking about friends that are the same age or colleagues that joined a company at the same time, for example, those people you can usually speak informally with. Now, it can get a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the general rule that you can apply. People above you, be more polite to them. People equal or below you, you can be informal with. The other factor that affects what level of politeness we would use when talking to somebody is familiarity. Generally speaking, the more familiar somebody is, the more likely you are to be informal with them. And the less familiar someone is, the more likely you are to be polite. Now, one way to think about familiarity is to break people into either in-group or out-group members. So, in-group members might be relatives, close friends, colleagues, or teammates, for example. People you are close to or have some kind of defined relationship with. Out-group people are basically everybody else. What that means is that with in-group people, you can be less polite, and with out-group people, you're more likely to need to be more polite. So the closer people are to you, the more likely you are to be informal. And that just makes sense. You're obviously not going to talk to your best friend or your family members using really stiff, polite language. Just as you're not going to talk to somebody that you meet on the street who clearly looks a little bit dignified, you're not going to talk to them using really informal language. At a high level, it's really quite logical. When we get into the details, it can get a little bit more complicated and messy, but generally speaking, this should be fairly intuitive. So those are the two factors that affect what level of politeness we will use when talking to somebody: rank and familiarity. So if we combine those two, we get something that looks like this. Generally speaking, those who are more familiar or of equal rank to us or lower rank than us, we're going to be more informal with. And those that are higher ranked, and particularly those who are less familiar, who are out-group members, for example, those are people we're going to be more polite to. It can get quite complicated, and it can be very tricky sometimes to know exactly what form of language you should use with somebody. Relationships change. Sometimes you might start off unfamiliar with someone and then become more familiar with them. Or you might start off at a lower or higher rank than somebody and then have those ranks swap. And in that case, what do you do? That can be quite complicated, even for Japanese people. So don't worry too much if you're not sure in a certain situation. Basically, what you should do as a general rule is start with the polite form. That's the safe way to go about it. From there, you can then try to figure out who it is that it's safe to talk to using informal language. Obviously, those that are close to you, or those that are equal rank to you and an in-group member, those are people that you can talk to informally. Also, people who are younger than you, or are clearly lower ranked than you. You can safely get away with using informal language with them. But the safe thing to do is to always start with the polite form and go from there. Determine when it's safe to go to a more informal form of language. I'll add though that Japanese people are very forgiving of particularly people who are clearly not native Japanese speakers. So you don't need to worry too much about if you accidentally use informal language when you should be polite. People will be forgiving because they can see that you're trying. The main thing is to be aware that these different levels of politeness exist and roughly when they should be used or when certain types of language shouldn't be used. And as you develop your Japanese speaking skills over time, you'll get better at knowing when to use each one in a particular situation. So don't worry too much about getting this exactly right. Try to be aware of it, but if you make mistakes or use the wrong type of language, don't worry, people will forgive you. And that is basically how politeness works in Japanese. As I said, the main thing that determines the politeness level of a sentence is the form of the main verb at the end of the sentence. If you want to learn how to express different verbs in both polite and informal Japanese, grab a free copy of my Guide to Japanese Verb Tenses and Forms. This free PDF cheat sheet shows you how to conjugate verbs into all of the major tenses and forms, both polite and informal, including a full page of examples. Just follow the link in the description to grab your free copy. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.